Make sure you subscribe to the Below the Surface podcast by Eclipsium in partnership with CRA. Myself and Scott Shefferman host this show. We've had the pleasure of speaking with some amazing guests, including Zeno Koba, Richard Hughes, Vincent Zimmer, and more. We discuss topics related to firmware and supply chain security, uncovering those pesky vulnerabilities that lie, well, below the surface in your environments. You can find all the episodes and subscribe by visiting eclipsium.com/podcast or searching for Below the Surface in your favorite podcast catcher. Welcome back, everyone, to Security Weekly. Follow Security Weekly on LinkedIn for updates across the organization, show highlights, and more. You can find us by searching for Security Weekly Productions on LinkedIn. If you want links to all my social media, podcast gear recommendation, links to the podcast I listen to, you can visit securitypodcaster.com. We're talking about the news this week. Very excited because we've got like a couple of weeks of news kind of queued up to talk about this week, which is really exciting. We've also got ShmooCon on the horizon. Bill, we were being nostalgic earlier and talking about our first ShmooCon, which was like 2006, which makes us like old.
Yeah, ShmooCon is always my favorite conference every year. Unfortunately, I won't be there this year, but I think it's the right size and the right amount of people and the right people. It's just it's a great conference. Unfortunately, I think that's where I met you, Paul. Unfortunately,
we did meet at ShmooCon. Trent I want to say Trent hacked core security. I don't think it was 06. I think that might have been 07. Was it 06 or 07?
I can't remember.
It was one of those early. It was one of those
that year, yeah.
So you realize that we now sound like old men going, well, when did that happen? 1962 or 1963? Going off into a 10-minute rant.
Which is crazy.
I was born in 1962. Thank you very much.
Right? It's crazy to think about. I was just earlier, I was talking about a post that Eclipsium made where we talked about the network device and appliance kind of hacking time frame, like timeline. And one of the first ones was 2005, and it was Mike Lynn. You remember Mike Lynn in his research into Cisco, like way back in the day? I was like, oh, those are my first early days at ShmooCon. And I took a long hiatus from ShmooCon, and I'm really excited to go back. I got my super duper flipper flopper, like ready to go. I've like begged and pleaded with my friends for a badge. Like this is the full ShmooCon like experience right now, right? Like it's not having a badge, not having a ticket rather, right? It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
I think probably everybody at Shmoo is going to be having to have a flipper, right? You're not a hacker anymore unless you bring one of those. So
it was Shmoo last year. I was like the only one without a flipper. I'm like, what is going on? I'm like, it looks like a toy.
A phone.
Yeah, I'm like,
that's it.
I'm like, it looks like a toy. I'm like, are you like what? That's what got me into the. And it was Tyler. That was like, no, dude, you got to get a flipper. He's like, I have one. Like, check it out. And I'm like, oh, I need one of these, devices. But like now, in looking at the flipper, we have a couple of stories that we should probably segue into. But I kind of like buying devices from China and other shady places that are a fraction of the cost of something that can replace like a huge amount of functionality on the flipper. Right, so like your RFID hacking, like we think Proxmark, and I'm like, well, cool. Like, yeah, sure, I could go to, and I love Garrett, and everyone should go to Hacker Warehouse, and you should order the hardware from him, right? And support Hacker Warehouse. I just want to throw that out there as that's your first option. If you want to like have a little bit of fun and take some risks, I think that's what it is. Like I did my Hack RF, I ordered from AliExpress. And my Proxmark, like I ordered at a steep discount from Amazon. And I'm like, I'm going to bring that to ShmooCon, and I'm going to ask my hacker friends if we can make this work. Right? Like to me, it's just fun, right? And it could fall flat on its face, and it could be out $139, right, for this Proxmark thing. But did I have some fun doing it? And will I need to go buy a $400 or $500 Proxmark, whatever, kind of thing after that? Maybe. But I had fun doing it, right? And so my friends are messaging me. I'm like, well, I'm bringing this hack thing that got delivered from Amazon today. Like, maybe you can help set it up. And I think to me, that's one of the huge benefits of going to an actual conference, meeting up with your friends, making new friends, is just hacking on stuff, right? Like, whether you're successful, it's just the experience of hacking on stuff. Also, I want to say, like, don't go just to like meet your friends that you already know. Get new people involved as well. If you're just getting into this field and you listen to the show, come flag me down, like, let's have a beer, right? Like, that's, to me, that's also the benefit of going to these shows is like, we just hang out.
People don't realize how easy it is to introduce yourself to people at hacker conferences. Generally speaking, people are very open to meeting new people, and you don't have to like say how elite you are. Just, say hi and hang out, right? Like, people are very approachable, and you should meet someone new. Always meet someone new.
Bring food or alcohol, and they're even more approachable.
For sure.
Or tobacco.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said to, like, let's have a drink together, let's have a cigar together. Even if you're not, like, flag me down in the hallway, flag any of us down in the hallway, and just be like, hey, how you doing? Like, hey, like, what are you working on, right? Like, have the conversation. That's the reason that we're there. It doesn't matter if I've known you for 20 years or we introduce each other at that moment in time. Doesn't matter. The reason I go is to again, meet up with people I've known for 20 years, but also meet new people too. So don't be shy. Come up, introduce yourself. It's totally fine. It's cool.
I want to point out one thing that's a bit weird about this community. It's a very high proportion of neurodivergent people. So if somebody hasn't seen you in 5 years and comes up and gives you a hug, it's because to them it's been about 30 seconds. It's not 5 years.
Totally.
Okay. I have many, many friends who I haven't seen now since COVID in years who will walk up to me and I will walk up to them and just absolutely envelop them in a hug. Okay. Because to me, it's been about 30 seconds. Like, there's no change just because I haven't talked to them in 5 years. I mean, I may have talked to them. I may not have. It doesn't matter. You're still my friend. Don't be weirded out if that happens to you.
And they're a good friend when you can pick up the conversation exactly where it left off 5 years ago and just continue. Like that's the best.
Yes, it is.
I want to talk about
one of those calls just the other night. Actually, I talked to Gillis. I haven't talked to Gillis in a while.
How's he doing?
He's doing okay. Is he coming to Shmoo? No. He's not going anywhere right now. He's recovering.
I feel like I saw him in Vegas.
Maybe.
Maybe.
It was either Vegas or GurCon. I saw him sometime in the last year.
Yeah,
might have been GurCon.
I didn't ask him where he was, but he was just basically like, he's recovering from some medical things that happened. He's doing well. He's doing fantastically well. He's living in his house that he bought. He's employed, and he's day by day, man. Life goes on. So it's interesting stuff. But yeah,
I want to talk about a couple of Flipper things. Wall of Flippers is a GitHub project that detects BLE spam. I installed it on my laptop. I came to the same conclusions that some of my friends came to as well. Like, this is great for detecting Bluetooth low energy spam, but could it be used for someone to compromise my laptop as well? Like, I'm kind of on the fence. Like, could you crash this stuff? Like, there's a cat and mouse game. I tested it very briefly today, right? Got it running, did a BLE spam on my Flipper Zero right here, which has the super duper flopper, which I plan to wear around my neck because I'm a nerd at ShmooCon. But also it executed that attack and it did detect it, right?
So what does it show on the wall of flippers? Does it show the name of the flipper as well as like what they were doing? What does it show?
I think it shows the MAC address of the flipper that is conducting the attack.
So we actually had an issue last it was a couple months ago. I think it was the November SecKC. We so every month we meet in Kansas City. All the hackers in Kansas City meet, and we met up at a bar, and so there was somebody that had a flipper, and it took out the point of sale system at the bar, and so we're trying to negotiate our way back and being able to have that meeting there. So it would be kind of interesting to have that kind of detection mechanism running in those kind of areas, right? Like, and I wasn't too upset about it, right? Because everybody, when you have a hack button in front of you, if it says hack, I'm probably going to press it, right?
You're gonna push it,
and see
yeah.
what happens. So, not too upset about it, but it sure would have been, it would be good to know like who was behind those kind of things, and hey, knock it off. These are our friends, right?
It begs this question. This particular attack bill is really begging this like ethical, moral question of: is it me as the attack, air quotes, like attacker, right? Am I the one that needs to check my moral and ethical compass, or is it the providers of these other services that are not resilient? Because I've heard it interferes with hearing aids.
That's simple,
insulin
Paul.
monitors,
Is your
right?
action illegal or illegal, regardless of whether there is? It's the legal argument of whether, if you're walking through an open door going into a house, are you breaking and entering? And I'm pretty sure the law.
So much, but that's I'm struggling with an analogy.
You're talking about the CFAA? I mean,
No, because I'm not. But I'm not.
What you're talking about?
I'm not gaining unauthorized. But hold on, I'm not gaining unauthorized access to a computer system and or physical dwelling or building. Right? I'm emitting packets that are causing disruption, which is interesting.
That's an FCC violation.
Is it? But
yeah,
it's on an
Yes,
open.
it is.
But it's on an open spectrum.
Nope. That's an FCC violation. The device must receive and not transmit any
Cause
So it's not a legal thing. It's just an
static or
FCC.
interference. Yeah, they'll put you in jail for that.
I agree.
One could argue,
Bluetooth, right?
Yeah.
It's just Bluetooth. Like everything has Bluetooth. So you're going to tell me that if I were to turn on Bluetooth on my phone and scan for whatever's around that's illegal?
If some device has an adverse reaction to another Bluetooth or Wi-Fi device in the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum that's not like intentionally jamming, is it right? I wish Larry understands.
I have
these
a response to this.
right?
Going back to my NSA days, where the ping command was considered by the lawyers to be an active attack because it elicited a response from the target. I would ask, if you're on Bluetooth and you're trying to figure out what's listening, are you just listening? Or are you emitting something that elicits a response similar to a ping? I mean, I assume there's a Bluetooth equivalent of a ping command.
No. There's no response. There's no response, Jeff. I can answer that with 100% certainty.
So how in what you're describing, are you determining if there's something out there? It's because they're emitting something. And if you're just hearing what something is emitting, I don't think that's illegal.
That's exactly the BLE spam that's happening. Is I'm emitting Bluetooth low energy packets. Devices are receiving that and interpreting it in a particular way. I get no telemetry back. Like it's built into the protocol. I get no telemetry back to know which device received my packets or how it responded to those packets.
Yeah, that's kind of like throwing a hand grenade over a wall, though, right?
Correct.
I mean, I think if you're emitting, that's something active. I'm guessing that the law would frown upon that.
So,
or FCC or whoever.
Section 15.15b refers to the operation of intentional or unintentional or incidental radiator, etc. You're not supposed to cause harmful interference, basically, and the law would cover it that way.
But it's not interference. It's the interpretation of various devices wanting to pair. It's not like I'm jamming the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum with garbage packets to cause adverse effects. I am sending out specifically Bluetooth low energy packets that are emulating certain devices that are being interpreted by
it wouldn't
iPhones, Android.
It wouldn't interfere, but I think it would fall back on that precedent. There's probably established precedent that connects those dots back to this specific thing. It wouldn't be that difficult.
But like it begs the question is like if anyone can pick up a Flipper Zero or an Android phone or a Raspberry Pi, anything that can emit Bluetooth low energy, like it's not specific to a Flipper,
sure,
can cause this attack. Like my moral compass is really like wonky on the, like I'm confused right now. Like is it the attackers that are at fault, or is it the vendors that have made shitty software that crash as a result of that? right, that are at fault.
Depending on who's talking, it's probably going to be the opposite party in both cases. If I were the vendor, I would point my finger at, somebody else and vice versa. Historically, that's true.
I think if you knowingly open up the BLE spam app on your flipper and you hit go, you are doing it maliciously and you were it wrong, right? Now, like that, I think that any reasonable person will understand that you had some malicious intent when you were doing that. Now, should phone makers and should there be protections to stop against that? Of course, but Paul, come on, man, when you're doing that you're doing it maliciously.
I'm going back to Bill when you described that, right? I'm going back to the telephony systems, right? Yeah, anyone can call anyone, but there's restrictions on those kind of spamming attacks or whatever to take down the infrastructure, right?
Well, you can't even on ham radio. You're licensed to talk, etc., on certain channels, but you can't play music. That's against the rules. It just completely it basically DDoSes the entire channel. Mm-hmm. So, not supposed to do that. It's not necessarily overtly malicious, but it does prevent other users from utilizing it in the way that they would expect. And I think
that's why when I'm going to the conference, I want to detect and monitor, not send out those attacks. Yeah. Because for me, I know I can send out those attacks and they totally work. Yeah. It's a proof point. Why do I need to do that? And the byproduct is if someone has an insulin monitor or a hearing aid or whatever, or a point of sale system, I can adversely affect those systems. I don't want to do that.
Yeah, and not even
I want to monitor other people do. To me now, the more interesting thing is monitoring other people doing that and going, how can I detect?
So this makes me want to produce a personal Bluetooth sniffing, personal monitor, basically. Something that I could put in my pocket, run off a battery, and be dedicated to this purpose that could run for an extended period of time. I built similar gadgets like that where all they would do is sniff packets and look for wireless access points or whatever they were. I would want to build something purpose designed for this to be just like a personal monitoring system for Bluetooth activity that I could just keep on and something the size of a cigarette packet.
You mean like the NRF 52840?
Maybe.
Would be the hardware platform you want to look at for doing that. Yeah.
How much money is this going to cost me?
Like $8.
That's a lot.
Yeah, couple bucks.
Nice.
$8 probably gets you 2, actually.
Ooh.
Yeah, just going back to the flipper. I bought one for my youngest kid this year. He's starting to become, he's a teenager now, and he's been asking me about hacking topics and those kind of things. And it was kind of like, should I not, exactly because of the conversation that we just had. Teenage boy, hey, look what I can do. Causes a lot of problems, right? But one of the things that I really liked about it kind of goes back to the whole Raspberry Pi thing. I gave it to him and he asked me what it did, and I said, go figure it out, right? I'm not telling you anything. I'm going to tell you that you're probably going to want different firmware on it, and you probably don't even know what firmware is. Go figure it out. And in an hour, he had it running, and he was having a lot of fun with it. I think those kind of things are real easy ways into getting to understand how, just how Bluetooth works, how firmware works, what's Linux, what's, what are all those things. I think it's a great device for on-ramping people into the industry.
But Bill, I like your ethos there, because it speaks to how I was kind of brought up in this industry, is that if you're struggling with something, figuring out how something works, spend 30, 60 minutes figuring out, and then ask a question. But ask a question that's based on your 30 or 60 minutes worth of research, right? Don't spend all day and burn your cycles, right? Because we at the time worked for a company, and they were like, oh, don't do that. But don't just come ask the question and expect the answer to be handed, because you're not going to learn anything.
Yeah.
Go spend your time, but it's a metered amount of time, right? So, and that's how I teach people to this day. Here's like your example, Bill. Like, here's the thing. Here's a Raspberry Pi. Go spend some time. Figure something out. Spend 30 or 60 minutes. Prove to me that you spent your 30 or 60 minutes in the way that you asked your question. I'll be able to tell if you spent the time or you didn't, right? Because if I've spent the time, I should be able to tell if someone else has spent the time. And then I'm going to help you. And I'm not going to give you necessarily the answer. I'm going to give you the answers that help you get to the answer, right? And that's the kind of knack to being a really good mentor is not giving the answer, but giving the answers that lead to the answer, right? So that you always remember. If someone just hands you the answer, you might forget that, right?
Sure.
But if someone hands you a portion of the answer that you got to kind of work out the rest of it on your own, you're going to remember that solution probably like for the rest of your life, right?
Go biblical.
Josh, your reaction tells me you remembered those lessons for the rest of your life.
Oh, well, I mean, come on, go biblical, man. You know, give a man a fish eats for a day, teach a man to fish eats for the rest of his life. Like, you're literally doing the right thing in a biblical fashion. You don't give answers, you give methods, you give process.
Yeah.
Like, it's literally, and the weird thing is, this is what we do for our kids, my 5-year-old and my 17-month-old. And how many of your kids have you taught? Like, oh, no, I'm not going to give you the answer, but you know the answer. Yeah, I know the answer, but that's because I figured it out. Right. You're going to figure it out too. I'm going to give you every resource you need. But you're
and good Lord, well, social media when it comes to Flipper Zeros, my story number 21, is not reality most of the time. All right, like you got to understand how rolling codes work and how the Flipper Zero operates, right? And this was a good article to kind of like level set, because I think if you've watched a video where someone's using a Flipper Zero to unlock a car, one of two things is happening. Well, maybe three. Like the third one is it's a really friggin' old, crappy Honda, whatever, and it doesn't have rolling codes. And yes, you can open the car. That's extremely rare. It's like probably 1% to 3% of maybe the cars that are on the road today, right? And everyone's like, oh, Flipper Zero can unlock a car. Like very small amount, like doesn't use rolling codes and you can unlock. Okay, put that aside for a moment. The other scenario is where you watch a video on social media and the person's unlocking the car and there's someone with the actual key fob unlocking the car while you're on your Flipper Zero and it's completely fake. I think there's a lot of videos that are on there and I hate that shit. And I'm going to call those people out for bullshit. Like, don't do that. The other one is like somewhere in between, right? Like it's impactful, but it's not really impactful because Jeff, you'll appreciate this, right? Like there's a kind of like, there's a shared secret basically between the key fob and the car that lets them select a seemingly pseudo-random passcode to unlock the car. And so what a lot of these videos aren't showing you, but are showing you, so the part that aren't showing you is when you push unlock on the key fob, they're banking on the fact that the car has not received the message, but the flipper has received the message. The flipper can then take that message and retransmit that without knowledge of the seed, but I can still send the right unlock code because that's the last one that came off the key fob that wasn't transmitted to the car because it hasn't incremented. Attack. It's basically a replay attack, but it's an important point, Jeff, is that it hasn't been received by the car because if the car receives it, it's going to increment based on the seed to the next number. And if you don't know what the next number is, you're not going to be able to unlock the car.
Yeah,
did I capture that? Did I capture that right, Bill? Bill, I believe you've done some of this like research, right? Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, well, I mean, so like I've just did probably like everybody here, just doing it with the flipper. But so the biggest problem is that those two items can get desynced, right? So if you were to do that, your key fob and your car can become on, they're transmitting completely different numbers, or like they're not in the same time, and now your key doesn't work.
Well, now you got to but to repair them, you got to go back to the manufacturer or the dealership, right? To repair them.
Yeah, there's also a lot of other attacks that not related to Flipper where they're proxying so not just the like the keys of where they work more off of like RFID and they're proxying that. That's a completely different attack than what the Flipper is doing.
And on the Tesla's Bluetooth Low Energy. Bluetooth or Bluetooth Low Energy or both. Because like if I accidentally disable Bluetooth on my phone, I get in my Tesla and it's like yeah, I don't recognize your phone. I have to then re-enable Bluetooth, and that's how it does the handoff. But I think it does a very similar kind of rolling code thing, but over Bluetooth. I haven't fully dissected how that worked, but also like it's fairly resilient. Although there are some edge cases where someone is able to control someone else's Tesla, which is kind of, we covered it on the show a while back, which is kind of interesting as well. Anyway.
Moving on.
Moving on. Sam, we haven't heard from you in a while, man. Pick one of your stories.
Sam's got a couple interesting stories.
Yeah. Well, I think probably the most interesting one I thought was number 7. The I in LLM stands for intelligence. It turns out, I didn't know this, people who run bug bounty programs get a lot of spam. And now what people are doing is programming AIs to go through the source code or something else about the product, write a vulnerability report, and submit it, hoping I'll get a bounty. So they're getting flooded with LLM-generated bug bounty reports at the curl project. And the problem is, it used to be that the spammy reports are in bad English and it's easy to spot them as garbage. Now they're written well, and they even look pretty plausible at first, and you have to put work into it to discover that they're garbage from an LLM.
But Sam, the striking thing about this story, and you're 100% accurate in what you've described so far, but when I read the transcript of this interaction, is that not only the initial report was chat GPT generated, when Daniel, what was his last name, Dave? Daniel, do you still have it up? The maintainer of the curl project. He's an amazing individual, and it's like we should all thank him for
Stenberg.
Daniel Stenberg did an interview on the Open Source Security Project. A fantastic individual, right? Don't hate on Daniel. Like, he's doing like amazing work and has to deal with this crap. Not only did the initial report come through, you have a vulnerability, Daniel, in your software, right? We've all written software, right? I think every single one of us on this podcast, right? And probably most of us listening have written software, right? So you've written software and they run it through ChatGPT and they go, you have a vulnerability. And you're like, well, you ask a question back to the reporter. They took that question and they funneled it back into their ChatGPT conversation. They took the response and they funneled it back to Daniel. And like, as I'm reading this, I'm like, all of the responses are chat GPT generated. I'm like, how is Daniel having this much patience? Like, Daniel is a super smart individual. He had to know pretty early on in this conversation, like, this is coming from chat GPT. I feel like he kind of played along until the end, where he was like, basically like justified in saying F you, right?
Yeah, maybe so. But anyway, it's a security professional version of the AI-generated spam problem that I've been hearing about. And I don't know how much it's become real, but this is certainly one real version of it. Like, there's supposed to be political deep fakes too. I haven't really heard about too many of them.
Yeah, but like Daniel, I mean, Daniel is the shining example of someone who's way smarter than ChatGPT. Like, that just goes without saying. Throughout the whole conversation, we're like, you're not going to outsmart Daniel, the curl maintainer, with ChatGPT. Like, what made you think that was going to be a plausible scenario? This is the person that has maintained the code for decades, right? At least over a decade. What makes you think you're going to outsmart that person on their own damn code base, right? Like, maybe in other areas, right? Like, if you talked NFL football with Daniel, like, maybe you could get into a debate, right? About Tom Brady versus Patrick Mahomes. Like, I don't know, Bill, I'm just pulling it out thin air. But on the curl code base, you're not going to win with Daniel, right? Like, no matter how much AI you have, how many LLMs you run through, you're not going to do that with Daniel.
Yeah, but how many programs don't have a single maintainer that's been there for 23 years since he created it?
I agree, Josh.
23 years ago, and that's the problem. Curl, as an example, is a great one of where the human is better than the machine, and I 100% agree with you. How many projects have been abandonware, then picked up by somebody? Have teams of people? I mean, look what's happened in the Linux kernel in the last 5 or 10 years. Okay, there have been like literal wars and revolutions over this stuff. Yeah,
okay. But I want to give props to the Linux kernel team, because even when they like meet up against actual humans, the Linux kernel team still wins. and we interviewed the person. I forget his name. Oh God, but there was someone that tried to inject a vulnerability into the Linux kernel via a pull request, and the Linux kernel team was like, "That's bullshit. I know this code like better than you. Like, no effing way. You're not doing that, right?" So, when you props to the Linux kernel team, they have a lot more lines of code potentially than curl does, right? It may be in different pockets. It's pretty comparable, right? But the Linux kernel team is doing a great job,
Still
Josh.
way too early. We're just way too early here. I think this is a reasonable area for AI to assist with projects, especially with large code bases. And actually, I kind of disagree with you, Paul. Like, so while the pro maintainer obviously is a brilliant person and obviously a brilliant coder, that does not mean that that they truly understand every vulnerability that possibly exists, right? Like, and I'm not coming down on them at all, like not at all, but I do feel like this is an area that potentially AI can help, right? So
No,
like,
but I agree. But hold on, Bill. I agree with you in that I don't think Daniel understands every vulnerability that's in the code. I think Daniel's ability to triage every vulnerability that's reported in the code is unprecedented. And I would love to see Daniel go, well, hey, wait, what if I train an AI model to go try and find a whole bunch of vulnerabilities? He could triage those really, really well and improve the code that he's working on, right? But I also agree that a human can't, even the maintainer of that project that knows every ins and outs of the code, can't predict and or identify every vulnerability. AI can, but the maintainer can certainly help triage that.
For sure.
I don't agree with this article. My story number one, the exploit prediction scoring system is awesome. I mean, awesome is a very subjective term in this context, right? But I think we put too much emphasis on, is this vulnerability exploitable or not, and the nuances that go into that. And I think in my time in this industry, right, I've seen a lot of vulnerabilities, and this is not necessarily very scientific, right? But I've seen a lot of cases where we, as an industry, believe a vulnerability to be of this severity, to be of this difficulty level of exploitability. And then later on, someone goes, oh no, like I figured it out, right? And I don't think AI is at a point where it can predict that, right? I think that there's very much Jared talked about it, right? And I think it's a very good analogy. He's like, AI is really bad at pointing out what's a random service that's created in Windows and what's a legitimate service. You need a human to look at that and go, wait, that's not a legitimate service. I think it's the same thing with exploit creation. I think it's this is impossible. Like, no, it's not really impossible because of this. And I think it's humans that are going to be like, this is exploitable. And to predict what is exploitable or define what is exploitable is a slippery slope. And you shouldn't bank your like risk equations and defenses on what's exploitable, what's not, right?
And then overall impact, along with trying to scale and weigh what is currently popular, what's trendy, because there's a ton of exploits out there that threat actors could be using that would be extraordinarily damaging, but they're not, because their own thought leaders are not doing those things, or it's not part of their economic process. They don't know how to refine it and turn it into money, or it's just not trendy right now. So just because something's possible and impactful doesn't mean it's actively being used. And you have to figure out how you're going to prioritize. This scoring system doesn't really take that into account. It's a good place to start, but it's not taking into account the individual environment or the current trend.
I think that this article delves into a lot of different areas of vulnerabilities and exploits, right? Like they say, they talk about 0-day exploits where the public doesn't know about the vulnerability for which no known patch currently exists. I don't know. In my experience looking at all this stuff, like someone could have an exploit for that. Does that mean I should or should not patch it? I think that's a smaller part of the equation than what we give it today. I think we need to look at where is that vulnerability in my environment? What does it impact? And prioritize the patch that way. Not so much who could have an exploit, does there an exploit exist? Because I think there could always be an exploit that exists. I think people are amazing and develop exploits. And quite frankly, if you develop a really good one, you're not inclined to talk about it.
But Paul, doesn't the exploitability impact the ranking or the score in the first place?
The risk, yeah.
But how do you gauge?
Was that a yes or a no? I'm not sure.
I'm going to answer your question with a question, Jeff. How do you gauge exploitability?
I think it clearly doesn't, because even presence of a known exploit doesn't change that number, right?
No, it does. No exploit. If there's a working exploit in the wild,
the
it
CVSS number.
It doesn't change the CVSS number, does it?
Does.
I think it's all about how cool the name is.
And if it has a logo.
Yeah, come on. A logo's important.
A logo,
and how
a
exploitable
song,
it is.
a website, a dance. I want to say a dance. For the next big exploit, I want to say a dance.
They have dances now?
Like the Macarena.
Is that like the new keygen music? Like, is that?
I might be. I'm trying to have a serious conversation. It may be the Tenable scoring, Paul. I don't know if you remember, but I'm pretty sure if there was a known exploit in the wild that impacted the CVS score, or maybe it was the Tenable score.
I just want to say you're on the wrong podcast if you want to have a serious conversation, Jeff.
I try. That's why you keep me around.
That's why.
Remember?
Yeah, you need to level set us.
We don't even have a real cake here.
That's true.
It's a faux cake, and Larry hasn't jumped out yet.
No.
Is it exploitable?
Of course it is. It's flammable.
I mean, everything is theoretically exploitable. That's what I'm like. How do you gauge how exploitable a vulnerability is, short of there being something exploitable in the wild, right? But
actually,
time and resources and impact.
This is not a joke. I mean, it is a joke, but it's not a joke. It's the Tyler giggle factor, or the Tyler smirk factor.
Yeah,
you say, Tyler, there's an exploit that does this. How exploitable is it? And depending on how wide he smiles.
No, hold on. Hold on, Josh. But I want to correct. There's a vulnerability that exists. Like, how exploitable is that? In popular belief. So here's my case. Popular belief could be no one's able to create an exploit like that. But how do you know? In my 18 years of podcasting and being connected to this community, even longer than that, I've met people that are like, no, I totally have an exploit for that, right? Like, that's my fear, is that we're banking too much on does an exploit exist or not, and losing sight of we should just fix this because it's critical to our environment.
Whether it exists or not, whether it's publicly known in the wild or not,
and actively being used,
and that's a big difference.
So if you're building a castle and dragons don't currently exist, but you think that they could, do you still build the castle to have like dragon response and detection?
Because someone could have a dragon.
Or
but they can fly.
Or do you build it for the guys that are out front that are trying to break down your walls and throw the spears at you?
I don't know, man. Dragons can fly and breathe fire. So,
but no one's ever seen one. And so, as best as you can tell,
until someone has, though, that's the thing with exploits is really
just because you haven't seen a dragon doesn't mean they don't exist.
True.
Exploits in this context are dragons that fly and breathe fire, but like you just haven't seen them yet. Until you do, and then you're screwed because you built a moat in a wall,
right? But
the dragon can totally fly over that and just breathe fire and kill everyone.
Right, Trogdor occurs. So, like,
but
prioritization. The Burninator. So he's screwing up the countryside. So that's when you take your risk scoring. You prioritize based on, okay, I've got to figure out mitigation techniques and detection for people on foot. Then I have to figure out for like motorized vehicles or something like that,
or rabbits that look innocuous but can kill everyone.
Very dangerous rabbits.
They call me Tim.
The holy hand grenade of Antioch.
I can answer your question, Paul. This is how we did it in that certain place I used to work for and I'm going back 30 plus years now, but we would try to calculate the impact of a vulnerability based on two factors. One was the likelihood that if somebody tried to exploit the vulnerability, and I'm somewhat paraphrasing because we didn't use this exact terminology back in the day, what was the likelihood that the attack or the exploit, if attempted, would work? That was one factor. And then the other factor was, what's the likelihood that somebody's even going to try to exploit this particular vulnerability or weakness in whatever? So that is how we used to do it when evaluating the security of systems that a certain place was producing or trying to produce. But I think Jeff, question,
hold on, Jeff, to your point, quickly, one is like the technical aspect of can this be exploited, and the other one is like kind of the juiciness of the target, right? And I think those are both valid measurements, right?
Not necessarily. Well, I mean, there's a lot of different factors that went into it. It's not necessarily the juiciness of the target, but it kind of sort of is. But we would measure the cost. What's it going to cost an adversary to build the little box to exploit?
Is the juice worth the squeeze? Right.
You could paraphrase it like that. Maybe sort of.
That's my Hollywood interpretation of this conversation.
One of the measurements was how much would it cost to build something.
Bill's shaking his head at me already.
The time into actually doing the exploit or accomplishing the exploit, and that could, it's not just dollar cost, it's opportunity, it's the investment of time, resources, and everything like that. But the measurement was always against. In those days, it was gross national product. These days, it's gross domestic product. But we would look at our adversaries, what we call nation states or APTs these days, and we'd say, what's their budget? How much do we think they're willing to spend to go after this, and what's the payoff? So it is sort of the bang for the buck. Yeah. Are they going to put that much into it?
But the economics has evolved significantly. We were talking about this on a webinar that I helped out with CRA, right? Like the Caesars ransomware attack, they paid $15 million, right? And the sponsor was eSentire and Keenan. Great. Like I asked him a question. I'm like, because he works in threat research. I'm like, where does that money go? How do they reinvest that? And his answer was like, basically, it's they're treating it like a company, right? Like they're investing in research and development. And that was kind of a stark realization for me as to how economically, Jeff, to your point, like when you factor in these things. Like today, I think there's a lot of money being thrown around because if you can net $15 million, think about if any one of us were to run a criminal enterprise, we get $15 million, and we're to ask ourselves on a Zoom call where we're all dressed in tracksuits, right? And we allocated some money for us to buy like really fancy gold chains and cars, and then the rest we're like, well, how are we going to invest it? We invested in R&D. They can find more zero-day exploits, right? And that was pretty much, Keenan's answer on this webinar. And I'm like, that's kind of telling as to economically how this stuff plays out. And my point is, defensively, we need to take this in consideration, right? We need to make sure that we're like, this is a reality.
Defensively, Paul, and this is the second point that I was trying to get to. I think our conversation as an industry, which for the last 25, 30 years has been focused on vulnerabilities, discovery, detection, remediation, I think we got to just stop that because nobody can afford to do all the things that need to be done to prevent, detect, resolve, patch all the vulnerabilities. They're in the risk equation. They're called a variable, but they're really not a variable. They're sort of a constant. I don't know the mathematical term for a constant that changes, but I think we need to rethink what we're doing and what we're investing in because, I mean, yeah, it props up our industry and allows a lot of companies to succeed. But what if and I'm saying this because this is the exact same discussion we had 25 years ago, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, and we don't seem to have moved the ball a whole whole lot down the field. We're still having this discussion. Maybe, just maybe, we should focus some our scant resources somewhere else. Not saying that we throw all this stuff out.
I like how you say 35 years ago, because that makes me feel young on my birthday. Jeff, thank you.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, well, I've been doing this stuff now for. I've been doing this over 40 years. So since you were a wee tyke in grade school.
Itty bitty hacker.
That makes me feel better. Thanks, Jeff.
Almost.
What? That he's old?
I mean, I can't speak for yourself. Maybe you were still in diapers when you were 7 years old. I don't know, but almost.
No, he hacked
I'd
them.
have to ask my mom. I don't know.
He hacked them.
No, I was out.
Was your mom wiping your ass when you were 7, or were you doing it?
I'd have to make a phone call. I'd have to phone a friend. I'd have to phone a friend to figure that out.
Oh man.
Well, it's good that you consider your mom a friend. That's good.
I was taking computer programming classes when I was 7 years old.
Okay.
And
Doesn't mean you were
it's
wiping
funny.
your own ass.
A few years ago when I went to the registry, like, funny aside, the lady at the registry was like, "Oh, I didn't know they had computers back then."
Oh,
I was like, "Oh,
ouch.
thanks for that." I want to talk about two stories that really come to top of mind that have to deal with geopolitical things that, like, Bill and I would call these shenanigans, but in a geopolitical context, take a very much more serious turn of events. One of those is that Beirut airport screens were hacked with anti-Hezbollah messages. Also, in Russia, Ukrainians hacked LED signs to display messages that were pro-Ukrainian messages on, like, the holidays in Russia, and the Russians that were victims of these attacks were arrested, which is just. But so the Russian-Ukrainian thing, I dug into a little more. It was a supply chain attack. Ukrainians actually hacked into the pipeline of the firmware for these, like, full LED screens, and were like, on this date, we're going to change the message to be a pro-Ukrainian message. So, like, picture this. You're a Russian citizen. You've got this really cool, you're a computer nerd, LED screen. You've installed this firmware from GitHub, and it had a timer on it that on the new year or whatever it was, I believe in the article, that it presented a pro-Ukrainian message. And the Russian authorities noticed this and came and arrested you. And so, like, now you're in the gulag or whatever it is in Russia, like, you're in trouble in Russia, which I kind of feel bad for the citizens to a certain extent, like, in this, because they just happen to live in a regime that's like your pictures, like, you're like, oh, I was hacked. Like, Russians like, I don't care if you were hacked or not, like, you're going to prison, right? So that's kind of an interesting.
It's Russia. They're ridiculous. And
Crazy.
their special military operation is going so well.
Right.
Okay. I talked to a friend of mine in Ukraine, just FYI. I know it's a little off topic, but I talked to a friend of mine in the Ukraine, and he goes, yeah, the real problem is lack of hands. I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, we keep taking territory away from them. We just don't have enough people to hold it.
Yeah.
So we give it back. Then we take it again. Then we give it back. Then we take it again. It's at this point, it's almost a game.
Sounds like World War I.
No, they're not. They're not being forced off of it. They just risk getting supply lines cut because they're overextending. So rather than get overextended, they just retreat and be like, all right, you can have it back. Can we come back Tuesday? You want some tea? Cool. Like,
but it's crazy. Like, it's crazy to think about, like, 20 plus years ago, we did these hacks as like what Bill and I talk about shenanigans, right? Like, we did these hacks just, like, for fun, right? For, like, I can prove I can do this hack kind of thing. We see a lot of examples of this, but now it's like shit got real, like, in the world we live in today. Like, Beirut airport screens being hacked with anti-Hezbollah messages is like that's like a real, it's not just shenanigans at that point, right? Like, is it hacktivism, or I think it's even a step beyond hacktivism, right? Like, you're hacking within this context.
No, I think that's called terrorism, Paul. When you're disrupting
Is
when
it
you're
though?
disrupting private citizens and disrupting a way of life and making things inconvenient, I think that's at least partially a definition of
But
terrorism.
I would call it warfare, not terrorism, Jeff. I would call it inclusion in warfare, right? In both examples.
Well, what would be more fun is if they
I don't think
deliberately.
they're mutually exclusive.
Well, no, they're not. But what would be more fun is if they spearfished with it, building utilities to be used by, say, high military officials, or doing firmware that's going to be updating to large pieces of scientific research equipment. I mean, they could destroy the brains of that country by targeting every mass spectrometer firmware or whatever. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I certainly feel like this is hacktivism. Pretty in my opinion, this is pretty clearly hacktivism, and just kind of thinking about like it's the way of the times. When we start talking about disinformation, that's always been a part of war. We when we had the capability, we would drop pamphlets out of airplanes, right? And now we have LED signs that can be hacked, right?
Right.
It's the same thing, and I guarantee you, like pretty much everybody on this panel, and probably most of the people listening, when they're in Vegas, they see the Vegas Sphere and think, I wonder if I could get my stuff on there, right? Like, is that terrorism, right? Like, if you were to put something on that,
That's a great question. That's a great That's a great question. If you put your face on there with, world's #1 hacker on there, then it's stupidity and it's criminal offense, and going for street cred, whatever. If you put up there, kill whatever some political figure, then it's hacked, or vote out some political figure, then it's hacktivism, and it's a different stripe of criminal offense, similar but not quite the same. If you do that and put up, and I'll use a recent example, the Bitcoin ETF was approved, SEC, then it's, what is that? Trying to influence the market illegitimately. I don't know what charge that is, excuse me. But then if you put up something to the tune of, so these are all crimes, don't get me wrong, they're all crimes, but they're all for different motivations. Same crime. I'm putting up a false picture on the Sphere, right? But different motivation. So which of those makes it warfare?
Well, the law calls that intent, Josh. That's
right, exactly. But the motivation going behind it is what changes the crime from hacktivism to vandalism or vice versa, or whatever. Okay. Similarly, you can say nasty words, but if you say nasty words against a specific ethnic group, it can be a hate crime.
Yeah.
Okay. Motivation. So I'm not saying you're wrong. Please forgive me. I'm saying, it's interesting seeing how the motivation of the person changes what it is and how we view it.
Yeah, for sure.
So what was the motivation, do you think, of the people that put a message up at whatever it was, Beirut Airport? What do you think their intent was?
What did the messages say?
I think that's hacktivism in my account.
I think it depends on what the message was, though. If it was, hey, I can do this, look what I can do, that's different from death to whatever.
The message said, do not keep silent about a violation of this seriousness, because this means that all of our people will be exposed. All of our cities, villages, and public figures will be exposed, is what the sign said.
I'm not certain I follow.
But that's hacktivism at its finest. And again, I
would agree that sounds like hacktivism.
Yeah, if we only had someone closer to the geopolitical climate, right?
Well, I mean, Lebanon has been, Beirut in Lebanon has been hosting some unpleasant people. They hold quite a lot of hatred toward Israel. They have been.
Yeah, my knowledge of that is so dated. I read the book called Delta Force by a Delta Force operator. So we're going back to the political climate that it's in the 80s, right? is how I think of when I contextualize that. I contextualize it based on the knowledge that I've acquired of that dates back to that time. Great book at Delta Force. You should absolutely read it. But it goes back to the initial attacks on. There was a U.S. embassy in Beirut that was attacked. Several employees and special forces operators lost their lives. But this is, again, going back to like late
There was also
80s,
a
90s,
barracks in the early 80s, a barracks in Lebanon where
I think
a
that's
whole
what he's
bunch of
talking about.
Marines were killed. That might be.
Yes.
I think that's what.
I think yes.
I think
Where
that's what he's talking
it
about.
was
The
a-
bombing
I
of the
remember,
Beirut
but I remember
barracks,
when the person who wrote the book was a Delta Force operator, was in Beirut in the embassy, talks about like standing at the sink, like doing dishes, and like there's bullets flying over his head, kind of thing. And then he was pulled from that scenario, and then after that is when the attack on the embassy happened, and like multiple people lost their lives. So that's how I, again, it's very dated historically, my knowledge on that. So let's move on to where do we want to go next?
But just for context, it was the Marine barracks in 1983.
Okay, that rings a bell.
So, oh my God, 40 freaking years ago.
Yeah, like what? Who was the Delta?
Is that 40 years? Jesus.
Yeah, that's 40 years.
God.
This was a really good book too.
I mean, I had high school friends that were Marines that were deployed. They happened to live, but they knew people that died in that thing. For historical context.
Yeah, I don't remember. There's lots of books on. I don't remember which one I read. Anyway, if you're interested,
But where I want to go next is all the SSH stories that you guys posted. There was all kinds of SSH interesting things going on. The first one that really caught my attention, Paul, was it was your story. Which one was it?
It was
about the terrapin flaw. Really caught my attention. So, essentially, there is a flaw in SSH that allows vulnerable servers to be able to downgrade the SSH protocol and be able to compromise that through a flaw in an older version of SSH. And the reason why this became so interesting to me was actually kind of throwback to your the exploit scoring is garbage. Because this one stands out to me as I don't know if any of you guys have been on a pen test. You find SSH servers that are downgradable, and how do you score those, right? Like they're generally pretty low, right? They're a low vulnerability. Hey, this is bad, but you guys should, and you guys should upgrade.
I would argue if you're illuminating vulnerabilities, you're not doing a pen test, but that's maybe a different topic.
It's fair. That's fair. That's a good point. I appreciate that. Like that, but this one kind of like throws back to Paul. Kind of what you were saying is, just because we say it's not, it's not exploitable, is that an issue, right? Like this is and I was just kind of biting my tongue as you were talking because I knew that we were going to hit this one later, but there's a perfect example of that where for years we're like, yeah, this is bad news, but we don't think anything can come of it, and then people get creative, right? I thought this one was really good.
I think this is a case where you need to. It's a great point, Bill. Like, in this case, when there's issues with open SSH or SSH in general, right? I kind of throw out, not even kind of, I throw out the notion of how exploitable it is because I take all those other factors into account. This is on all, if I'm running multiple Linux systems as I do, right? This is on all of my Linux systems, comes down by default. It very likely could be exposed to the internet, whether it is or not. A simple configuration mistake could make it exploitable, exposed, I should say, to the internet. If it's not exposed to the internet, it's exposed internally. It's my primary mechanism to maintaining my systems. If there's any type of vulnerability in SSH, that gets the highest level of like patching attention to me. Also, the other thing that plays into that is when I patch SSH, it typically doesn't break anything, right? Or if it does, I can easily like get around that. I'm patching my clients, I'm patching my servers. Like, there's no real like great reasoning you could bring to me if I was the CISO and you were administrators and you're coming to me like, oh, I can't update SSH because of this reason. I'd be like, bullshit. Like, we can update SSH, and we should, regardless of the severity. It doesn't matter because of all the things I listed before. Like, it's listening on all systems. It's probably exposed to the internet. There's lots of configuration options, so it could be configured insecurely, could be configured more securely, or somewhere in between.
Here's the challenge, Paul. We can all intuitively agree with that, but how do you put that down on paper? How do you categorize it and rationalize it in an objective way so that management can sign off on it? You know, how do you measure it in such a way that you're saying this is a critical function? It's the backbone to a whole lot of things. How do you describe it or categorize it in a way that lay people that happen to control the purse strings will understand and respond?
It's a great question, Jeff. And I think if I'm like the CISO in this scenario, right? Like, I've set the precedent that like when we have vulnerabilities or exposures in our methods for remote access and administration, those deserve the highest level of due diligence and patching in our organization because of all the reasons I mentioned, right? Like, it's exposed. It's go ahead, Sam.
You're signing a high impact, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's a high impact and a low cost to patch, so that would make it a high priority.
I agree. I love that, Sam, and that's one factor we've been remiss to talk about recently is the low impact to patch, right? Like, I put RDP in this scenario too. We got stories about free RDP and the vulnerabilities that were discovered with memory allocations and free RDP and vulnerabilities in SSH fall in the same category. For me, is that let's just patch them. Like, what's going to like the impact of breaking?
I think we call that low hanging fruit, but what it doesn't address satisfactorily to my way of thinking, though, is the no-brainer low-hanging fruit. Oh my gosh, this is something we've got to do. But it's going to be expensive, time-consuming, costly, and all those types of things. That shouldn't necessarily preclude you from prioritizing and fixing it.
Yeah, but to your point, Jeff,
it needs to be a weighted. It needs to be a weighted scale, and some things need to trump other aspects.
I think we should lower our expectations almost, or lower our requirements that how difficult this stuff is to patch, right? Like, you should just patch this. There needs to be classes of things that we just patch because we know it's high impact and in low kind of operational risk, right?
Right.
This is one for me, this low operational risk, high impact. And there's a lot of nuances in there, but I'm like, if it's OpenSSH or it's RDP, doesn't matter the severity of the vulnerability. It's still pretty low impact, but high risk because it's remote access software.
I mean, you asked a question around like, how do you convince people that this is needed and et cetera? Often if I note that that's a barrier, like they're just not getting it, they're not picking up the necessity. I have a couple different mechanisms that I'll use. So like sometimes I'll educate them to the point of, I'm going to show you exactly how to do this attack yourself. And from there, I think you'll be able to understand how easy it is. And then we can show you how impactful it could be. Like, I'm going to do a demonstration in education section.
Dude, RDP was my shining moment. Right. It was a turning point in my career where I went to the Windows administrators who I had a great relationship with, which is a very important point to the story, right? And a lesson you should take away. I had a great relationship with our Windows administrator.
Social capital matters.
Right? It does. It's a great way to, social capital is a great term. I love that. Yeah. And I went to them. I'm like, look, RDP, I can totally sniff your credentials. And they're like, but Paul, this is the method that Microsoft is recommending how we gain remote access. I'm like, I get that. I'm like, but still, I can sniff your credentials. And they're like, I don't necessarily like want to like disbelieve that or whatever, but they're like, and I'm like, I get that. I'm like, can we do an exercise? Like I kind of cut them short. I'm like, let's do a test. I'm like, to Jared's point in the previous segment, I'm like, let's kind of purple team this together, right? Let's set up a session. Let's see how this attack plays out. And I was able to get their credentials. And I was like, okay, so here's where we're at, right? And I'm like, I'm not saying you should like rip and replace, like let's set off every fire bell and alarm. I'm like, but we just had a finding. Like, let's work on this together. Like, how would we solve this problem? They came up with, like, they were now motivated. This is what I think is the like pinnacle of security, is that your non-security people are now motivated to come up with a more secure solution because you're working with them. Like, I'm like, look, I'm not the adversary here. Like, I'm not the attacker that's stealing your credentials to do bad things. I'm on your side. Like, how do we solve this problem together?
My only problem with that, Paul,
but we solved it together, Jeff. Right? Don't take away from my huge win here, Jeff. We solved this problem together. We made the world a better place, and we found a more secure way to remote access systems.
How are they doing now? No, I agree with that. I've had similar experiences, but my curmudgeon-y gripe about that approach, which sort of ties into the whole why do we have red teams, blue teams, purple teams, green, yellow, fuchsia teams. You hire us as experts and professionals and people that know what we're doing. When the F are you going to just take our word for it? Why do we always have to constantly prove it to you, and or prove how easy it is?
I don't think it was proving how easy it is. I think it was a collaborative test to go, how does this play out in the real world? Right. I think there was an element of.
So you were the first purple team exercise.
Yes. So, no, I don't want to say it was the first purple team exercise. Right. I was saying it's an example of. Mm-hmm. We did trust each other at that point, but I think we're both at the kind of juncture where like let's prove it not just for ourselves, but also to justify time from management. Right. I think that
yeah. But there how many times?
I think what was remiss in my story was how do I get management approval to like allot for time for the Windows team to completely change how they authenticate to administer systems. I think that played into it, Jeff. So in that scenario, we were on the same team.
How many times have we heard, well, it hasn't been a problem yet. Nothing's happened yet. Why do you think this is a problem?
No, that was definitely an aspect to it. And I don't want to put that all on the Windows team. I think it was also management too. My management, their management. We got a lot of things going on. Right. I mean, we're talking like, earliest 2000s when we're building out Active Directory infrastructure at a university. There's a lot of things to do. How do we allot for time for this? And I think the win is collectively we're saying this needs attention. Both security and systems administrators are saying this needs attention.
You're tapping into psychological problems that exist outside of cybersecurity. Like we should all eat right and exercise, and yet we frequently don't.
We should have super secure locks on our homes. But
exactly.
Again, nothing bad has happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but until you have a breach,
well, if we're honest, we should never get out of bed in the morning. We should just keep the covers
It could be
over.
dangerous.
Right. And
floors
but like Josh,
there's all sorts of things that could happen.
But Josh and I talk about locks, right? Like, we got these super secure locks, and what is the brand from Amazon? I don't remember, Josh and Tyler.
It's the TS99 or something. It's the combo, the code lock that we use. My 5-year-old has her own code, by the way.
Tyler uses them. Josh uses them. I use them. And what we figured out collectively is that, they're bypassable. There's ways to make it more secure, right? But like, how do you justify and have those conversations about what's the appropriate level? Do you fill those with epoxy or Loctite so the screws can't be removed from the back of the door handles, right? Like, what's the appropriate level of security on them?
It's different for everybody. Yep. It's your own process. Yeah, exactly. Everybody's risk.
It's your own threat tolerance level.
I like that. Threat tolerance.
I have friends that have cameras around their entire house, And they, my dad was like, why the do you have cameras at your house? I mean, maybe a doorbell. He's like, I get a doorbell camera, but why else? But you have cameras at your house? And I'm like, Dad, your threat model at, as a friction scientist and a college professor is very different than mine. He's like, why? I'm like, because.
No, wait, hold on. Your dad, all the kids have moved out of the house at this point, right?
Yes.
Because internal threats are one of the reasons why I have cameras just as much as external threats, by the way. Because I have three kids that are very much hackers, right? And I'm concerned about the internal threat and the external threat in this model.
Well, it's interesting. Like, there are cameras, very few cameras inside my house, but there are a few.
Yep.
And they monitor some common areas and some doors.
I don't like to record. Now, I don't know, Josh, about you, we're getting off a tangent, right? But I don't like to record on my internal cameras for privacy reasons, right?
Right.
I like to use them as kind of like monitoring, like I can check in on them if I need to.
Yeah.
I don't like them to record internally in the house. Externally, record all day long. I
record.
I got recently a funny story where we had like 50 people over our house. My son's soccer team, right, came over, and like it started to add up. And the coach comes in actually, and he's like, Paul, you got like a neighbor that's complaining about noise. I'm like, that's interesting. And my wife went out and dealt with it and described this kind of like hilarious exchange. I'm like, you know what's great is like the day after the party, I can go on my camera footage and I can watch that exchange and I can laugh at it. Which I did, by the way.
I carry all my footage at home. That's where all my footage lives, and I remote it to other places elsewhere for just in case. But like, I'm careful where I put cameras, but I have cameras. And most of my friends do too.
I want to change
because
gears.
Our threat model is different.
I want to change gears before we run out of time, and I want to talk about. Did you guys read my story number 8? The title is I hacked my internet service provider's router so I could get rid of it.
But like,
did you guys watch? No, hold on. Like, be honest. Did you guys watch the 9-minute and 42-second video that's associated with this story? Show of hands.
I did.
How many people watched it?
I did not.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I didn't either, but I get the general gist, and I have a rebuttal.
That's fine. I forgive you. But hold it. I want to give you the TLDR. This person who lives in a different country, I want to say it's not Germany, but it's some European country that issued these routers from the ISP. I think an important point to the story when you watch this video is the router that they issued this person is super ugly. Like, it's really, if you had to think about this being in your home, like it looks like it has fins.
It's like a radiator.
It's red and gray. Like, it's ugly. Secondly, it has an SFP. So those of it working in networking, right? Like the fiber optic connectors that you put in your switches. We actually have some here in the studio. And I remember it when I worked for a university and we were doing a network upgrade, lots of conversations about SFPs. And I was talking to one of the network engineers. I'm like, how much do those things cost? And they're like, it depends. They're like, this is what I'm holding in my hand. Like, we almost need to keep this in a safe. I'm like, really? He's like, these can be thousands of dollars just for like one SFP. And SFP, what does SFP stand for? I don't remember. Does anyone remember what that stands for? We could look it up. I remember what it stands for, but it's a fiber optic connector. And all this person wanted to do in this context, right, is take the SFP from the ugly router that had proprietary firmware and like horrible security. Like, if you ever looked at an IoT device like many of us have and reverse engineered the firmware, like I do pretty much all the time in the context of my day job, right? I just want to take it out of this stupid device. I want to plug it into like my Ubiquiti like router and switch, and I wanted to recognize it as my like point of presence, like my POP from my ISP. Because I couldn't do that. And long story short, he figured out like there's firmware on the SFP that's like coded that talks to like daemons that are running, and he goes this whole explanation. He spent a lot of time. Now, conceivably, those of us that have reverse engineered more firmware and are more familiar with SFPs and reverse engineering probably could have got, like, my estimation is, first, mad props to this person for doing the amount of learning that he did. He's like, I'm a software developer with some networking experience, and it took me a long time to figure it out. If you've done, like a lot of my coworkers have done a lot of this work, could have gotten to this result like a lot faster. But like, I give this person who put this video together like a ton of credit because he was freaking relentless. Like, I'm going to reverse engineer it. I'm going to learn. I'm going to figure it out how to get it to plug into his Ubiquiti switch, and gives the whole story in like a high level. Like, everyone needs to go watch this video because he did an amazing job putting all this together. And again, like, some of us that are more experienced in these areas are going to go, well, you could have just like reverse engineered this or that or the other thing, and that's fine. And that's fair.
Did he get it though?
And he did it, dude. He freaking got it. He got there, and like, dude, so much respect to this person. It is like there are certain projects like I take on or start to take on, and I run that by my like internal team that I work with at Eclipsium that are amazing security resources, and they're like, that's a lot of work to get to like what you want your end goal to be. Like, not saying it's impossible, but like, it's a lot of work to get there. And oftentimes I punt on those projects, or I'm the person that's like evaluating the initial stage, and I hand it off to our researchers. I'm like, dude, I think there's something here. And then, like, full disclosure, not disclosing any details, they're like, yeah, we gotta wait because like we're doing disclosure with the vendor. I'm like, awesome, right? Like, I'm kind of like that catalyst. In this case, this dude took it like soup to nuts, totally reverse engineered the whole thing and got it working, and provided an awesome explanation in this YouTube video and on his website. Like, awesome
It's
stuff.
quite possibly the ugliest router I've ever seen. I went over and looked at it. It's unbelievable.
I love that like the hacker ethos was, I don't want this ugly piece of equipment in my home, dude. Like, I love that was like part of his motivation was like the router was ugly. Awesome.
The obsession was because the aesthetics of the thing.
Yes.
Dear God.
Yes. Thank you, Josh. The aesthetics were so heinous that he spent like a better part of 6 months to a year reverse engineering it, so he didn't have to have it.
I mean,
and there's like 500 people.
Like, so much respect, dude. So much respect.
And there's like 500 people that are gonna be like, oh, that's awesome, and do that and follow all the steps to do that, just so they can get rid of that ugly piece of crap.
Also, God, I did not realize that SFPs have their own firmware. Like, there's a full freaking Linux stack on some of these SFPs. And some of my coworkers, even at Eclipsium, were like, wait, what, really? I'm like, dude, watch this. They're like, holy crap. Like, some of these SFPs actually have firmware. I'm like, my challenge now is to the community, how do we get malware on some of this SFPs, right? Like, how do we backdoor the firmware on some of these SFPs?
I hate to break it to you, but that already exists.
Right.
And, you know, we,
Wait,
I can't really talk much
hold
about
on.
it.
But this is your not your last job, but the job before that stuff.
That's right.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Dude, I was amazed. I'm like, this is amazing research. And you just back that up, Bill, by the way. I don't want to give too much away, but you just back that up. Thank you.
I may have already said too much. All right, Jeff.
Jeff, talk about the 3-letter government agency you used to work for to take the heat off Bill right now.
Yeah.
I actually was at the National Cryptologic Museum today. One of my good friends from the community came in early. They've been wanting to have me give them a guided tour of the National Cryptologic Museum since before COVID began, so 4 or 5 years. Update on the status of my little whiz wheel thing. They're projecting that they will put it on display end of April, beginning of May. So I one of my little inventions will be in the National Cryptologic Museum in the next couple of months.
That's awesome.
Cool. What? I don't know anything about it. What is it?
Cue the decoder wheel theory.
Hold on. I'll show it to you. Real quick.
I got one. I got one right here too.
Oh yeah, it's right there.
I was wondering what that
So
was.
I
this
did
it
work
right here?
with U.S. Special Forces in my 3-letter agency days, and this was a little cryptographic cipher wheel that it emulates the algorithm that was used with one-time pads by U.S. Special Forces. So what Paul is holding is a little bit bigger, but it was a little 3-inch aluminum wheel. It's 2 wheels that emulate an algorithm called a visionaire table, which is the alphabet with 26 different offsets of the reverse alphabet, which is how a one-time pad works. So, not to digress, but I came up with that as a crutch for me. Ended up producing 15,000 of them, and they were used by U.S. Special Forces from the late 80s into the early 2000s, and yeah, it was a thing I did.
It's amazing.
That's badass.
That's awesome. Congrats. That's cool.
I have to ask, are you going to upload an STL to any of the 3D printing sites of this wheel? So, like, viewers at home can download it and print one of their
That
own?
would be really cool.
Oh, that would be interesting. I mean, what Paul was holding up, there's a guy in Florida that does wooden replicas of cryptographic devices.
Yeah.
He's got like, a three rotor version of the Enigma machine. He's got my wheel, a couple other cipher wheels and stuff like that. It's a total, don't forget to drink your Ovaltine type of thing.
Mm.
But I don't want to take away from the guy that makes these wooden replicas and sells them. Just go buy one, for crying out loud.
You
can find it on Etsy. Search for
Diana.
Diana cipher wheel, and you should find it. Diana Special Forces cipher wheel.
Speaking of 3D printing, what's really funny is that I've got this Make It Hacking makes a super duper flipper flopper,
Right.
which I plan to wear at ShmooCon as part of my badge ensemble, if you were, as it were. And it's tough to see, but like
I plan to be outside smoking cigars while you're walking around getting all the attention from that thing.
I'll probably be out there smoking cigars with you. Any conference, if you want to find Jeff or I, will probably outside smoking cigars. But one of the things with this is they Make It Hack and 3D printed this attachment for the Flipper Zero. And across the top, it's supposed to say "Hack the Planet." Mine broke, and so it kind of broke off like a little tab right here. And when I looked at it today, I was like, "Oh!" And right now it says "Hack the P."
Hack the plan.
Mine says "Hack the P." So if you see me at ShmooCon, you can make fun of me for the super duper flipper flopper that says "Hack the P," not "Hack the Planet."
Somebody might fix it for you while you're there.
You did get a vasectomy, so you did hack it.
I did hack the P, so maybe I should leave it like that.
The denial of service attack, technically.
The P, I do not understand. Think you understand in that.
But I want to talk about the.
Let's talk science. Can we talk science?
Let's talk, but let's talk about the right to repair nightmare that was a group of Polish hackers that hacked the train, right? Open Source Security Podcast did a great segment on this, and I picked up on the story. This is like it's really disheartening to me that we use these technological security boundaries to disallow folks from repairing their own stuff. And this is a self-aware kind of train that's like, if you're trying to do maintenance on the train and it's not part of like the sanctioned maintenance from the company, it's self-aware from that and it shuts itself down. And these Polish hackers figured out a way around that, from what I understand from the story, right?
Well,
it's very John Deere-like.
Yeah.
But also like trains are also like, to me, a part of like public safety, public transit. Like train to me should be kind of like more open technology, not like, oh, if you're getting like thousands of people around a day in your country via this train and it breaks down, you have to bring it back and pay an exorbitant amount of money to get the train fixed because that's just going to reflect itself on dollars from the taxpayers, which doesn't sit well with me. And with
But
these
it's not the
Polish
train
hackers-
as much as the tracks and the switches and things like that.
in this case, though, but in this case, it
the
is
infrastructure.
But in this case, it is the train. There is some infrastructure. I agree, Jeff. Like that has to be maintained, and I'm fine with that. But to work on the train, like these hackers figured out a ways around this restriction, kind of similar to the John Deere thing. Josh, sorry, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah. So the train, like John Deere said, you can't repair your tractor without using the appropriate John Deere firmware and diagnostic tools and things like that. But they'll sell them to any repair shop you want. The train manufacturer, Newag, I think it was, said you can't repair anything if you don't give it to us to repair.
Right.
But they never put that in the contracts. What they did was with the GPS tracker, they just said if it sits at somewhere where we think there's a repair yard, we're just going to disable the train.
Correct.
That
Yes,
is the
thank you.
illegal part. I don't know how
so
legal it is.
Did they deem that illegal with EU legislation?
See, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's illegal because you're disabling something that I purchased. And what they're doing, and with the effed up part of this whole thing is that the manufacturer turned around and said, no, we didn't disable it. It's just that you used an unapproved vendor and they screwed it up. And it's like, no, jackwagon. Sorry, try again.
Yeah, but here's the case. We get into international laws, right? Like, I like the right to repair that we've fought for here in the U.S., but when you take that into a global context, lines get crossed potentially, right? That's where
I don't know if we're allowed to say jackwagon on air. Like, are we allowed to say jackwagon? No, jackwagon.
I would never.
Fucking right we are.
In the 18 years of this podcast, Bill, I would never censor anyone. You know me. I would never censor anyone. You can say jackwagon as much as you want.
Hell yeah.
Unless we trip up a paying sponsor, and then we'll pull the episode. Not that I've ever caused that or anything.
That is, to my knowledge, never happened. We've only pulled one episode, and that was as a favor to a friend that was in the situation. Like legit, like we've done 18 years, like we've never pulled content. So you can say jackwagon as much as you want. Say it again.
Is that like
Jackwagon. Fuck. Damn. Shit. Crack.
Crack.
crack?
Phooey T-Wiz, I burnt the muffins.
Your butt muffins. Anyway.
I want to talk about Linux firmware for a moment. My story number 20. Do you guys run Linux? I mean, like I run it as my desktop, and you guys run Linux. And one of the packages on Linux is kind of like it's interesting because it's kind of like a pseudo meta package for a whole bunch of other software, right? Am I capturing that correctly? Those that know more about, there's a lot of people that know more about Linux than I do, right? But the way I think of Linux firmware is they take both open source and proprietary kind of blobs of firmware and include that in the update process. I want to give you an example of that because one of my systems runs an AMD processor that was vulnerable to, what was that vulnerability thread something? The really bad one. Sam, what was that? It was a speculative execution vulnerability in AMD processors that was really bad.
There was Spectre and Meltdown.
But it was because it's AMD. It wasn't Spectre and Meltdown. It was it was fairly recent. I'm just having a mental block, right?
Zenbleed?
Zenbleed. Thank you.
Somebody's yelling it out.
Yeah, thank you. It was Zenbleed, right? And so working for the company like Eclipse that I do, we test this kind of stuff. We live in kind of the firmware microcode kind of level, and I'm like, Zenbleed's really bad. And they're like, why, Paul? I'm like, because I ran it on my system that was vulnerable to it, and I could totally see memory from other processes that I should not have seen. Then at some juncture, the Linux kernel was like, oh, we can apply that microcode update for you, Paul, and it comes down as part of Linux firmware. And then after that, I was like, oh, the Zenbleed exploit doesn't work anymore. I'm like, that's awesome. So there's a whole host of software in the Linux package that is available on a GitHub called linux-firmware. I've always kind of been enamored with this since I started at Eclipsium and looking at firmware. And what Nicholas did was he took all the software in linux-firmware because it's public open source. Now, some of that's compressed, some of that's encrypted, some of it's not. And he started doing analysis like, let's take this linux-firmware, like based on the entropy, clearly compressed, based on the entropy, like clearly encrypted, but then there's these other ones that are not. So let's start doing some analysis on that. I was like, that's kind of interesting. Like, what if we took all the linux-firmware, the firmware that's inside of that, and started doing an analysis, which is kind of like my whole supply chain kind of thing. Like, how much do I trust that firmware coming down on my system? What do I trust the Linux Zenbleed patch that's coming down? Do I trust all the firmware inside of that?
Oh my God.
Nicholas did this like
The
whole
compiling the compilers.
correct, right? So Nicholas Stark is like, what if I started analyzing, like, is this Linux firmware similar to this Linux firmware based on entropy? Is it encrypted? Is it compressed? Is it not? Like, what if I start analyzing that? And like my whole thing when I got like based on Nicholas's research, I'm like, what if we started looking for vulnerabilities in what's inside of Linux-firmware? Like, what would we find? And that started getting me thinking about, what if we were to look at firmware that's Linux-based, as an example, and not all the stuff in here is Linux, but like, what if we started looking at Linux-based firmware and going, I'm going to analyze this firmware, and I'm going to look at all the Linux packages and see what version they are and how old they are. And that's kind of what sparked the train of thinking of, if it's 8-10 years old, maybe it's vulnerable, maybe it's not. But whatever the case, the fact that it's older Linux software in this firmware is indicative to how much I trust it or not, right? And so Nicholas Stark, who I've interviewed on the Below the Surface podcast, right, was very astute in analyzing this firmware and making us think about, like, how much do I trust that or not? So really cool. Go read it. He's got a whole website that he created based on this analysis and like looking at all of this different Linux firmware. It's cool.
Yeah,
stuff.
that's incredible. I was just as you were talking about it, Paul. I was browsing the website. That is he has done a ton of work, and this is absolutely incredible. I can't wait to dig in more here. One thing that if you haven't watched it, Tom Pohl did a talk at this last year's DEF CON about finding private keys in firmware analysis. And just as I was browsing through the site that you were just talking about, that reminded me about that. And that was a very, very interesting talk. If you didn't watch it, I think, Paul, you specifically would really like it.
Yeah, it reminds me of the EMBA team is awesome. So these researchers that work for Siemens created this open source project called EMBA. And they love when I talk about it, which is indicative. It's like our missions are aligned, right? Like I want to get people more in tune and thinking about what if there are vulnerabilities in firmware, and their mission is aligned to that. EMBA is an amazing project where it can take firmware and do exactly what you're talking about, Bill, right? Like are there keys? It has a whole facility inside of it. Like you basically give it a firmware file, and it does all kinds of stuff. One of the things is like, oh, I'm going to enumerate all the keys inside of that. I'm going to enumerate all the password hashes inside of that. And I'm going to attempt to crack those password hashes inside of it. It's one of the tools I use, again, in my capacity of like identifying for our researchers at Eclipsium, is this like, what else could you do with this, right? So like I'll take firmware that is based in the headlines, and I'm like, I ran it through EMBA. I'm like, here's what I found. Again, EMBA or any automated tool is not going to tell you like, here are all the vulnerabilities, like 100%. I'm going to emulate a human being and tell you about all the things in this firmware. But it doesn't do that. But it gives you a lot of indicators that I can give to my research team to be like, I think there's something here. And they take those and they go, yeah, like, I don't want to give too much away, but in some circumstances that you'll find out in the coming months, yeah, there's stuff there, right? And I think the EMBA team is like near and dear to my heart, that they want to like highlight that firmware has these like heinous vulnerabilities that we have to be paying attention to. What was that motion, Bill? What was that? You all right? You good?
That wasn't for you, Paul. Thanks for calling me out. But
Okay.
yeah, like,
Hey, you're wearing a Chiefs hat, so I'm going to call you out every chance I get. So there's that.
yeah, well,
that's bad.
We'll see about how the Super Bowl goes, I guess.
I saw something. It was funny. I was telling my kids, and like I have 3 kids, and like they have like a different interest in sports. My youngest is definitely a sports fan, and I'm like, I watched some kind of like Instagram, TikTok video where they predicted the Bills to win the whole thing, and I'm like, what do you think of that? And like, dude, like the debates that happen with all that kind of stuff, but I don't think it's gonna be the Chiefs.
Maybe not. I don't know. We got Taylor Swift on our team, so I think we're probably headed to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, and she doesn't carry a ball
if you
too
don't
well.
win, you can always just shake it off. I mean, there's that.
Yeah.
I love Josh's reaction to that comment was the best.
So
You got to do something now that the Patriots suck, right, Paul?
This is true. I mean, we could do a whole segment.
We just hope it's not 30 years like the Redskins / Commanders.
Okay, so you know what? You want to talk this? Fine. What's your predictions?
it's not like it's being recorded, so it's fine.
I don't know. I agree with the Bills taking it all. I don't. I mean, even though I had to concede that like the Chiefs may make it farther than the Bills.
I live near Baltimore. They're pretty much convinced that they're taking it all.
The Ravens do have a good team. And my youngest son who loves sports is like, he has no, like his allegiance to sports team is like, I want a Lamar Jackson jersey. I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, if you get one, like you can. I'm not going to say no, but you might be living in the shed for like a year. So, I mean,
So make
that.
a prediction and stop pussyfooting around.
I don't make predict. I like watching sports. I don't like making predictions.
All right.
I did fantasy football for 1 year and I was terrible at it. Terrible.
I will predict someone will win, another team will lose, and I think I've got a good chance.
You could also throw controversy in there too, right? Like someone will win, someone will lose, and there'll be some controversy. You can just almost guarantee.
I wondered, hey Sam, could we talk about your story number 8?
Oh God! Please get us off sports and something on cybersecurity for the last.
I'm too nerdy.
Either science or 23
minutes. 8 minutes. Let's talk about hacking and cybersecurity, please.
8 minutes, number 8, and we're talking about this is particularly near and dear to me. I care an awful lot about like when cybersecurity impacts human life. So I really want to understand your perspective on this.
Yeah, well, it's not very complicated. I mean, when the ransomware hits hospitals, it then delays care. It takes them longer, and the total number of treatments they can do went from like 3 a day down to 2 a day, something like that. And so you can just calculate how many people probably died from that. That's what they did. They didn't prove that these people died specifically because of ransomware, but they did figure out how many people do die from ransomware attacks on hospitals. And they figured out it was like between 40 and 60 Medicare patients. So this may help to convince management to take security more seriously. And that's
Except
over
they're Medicare patients, and that implies that they're subhuman somehow.
Well, yeah, but this is why, like many other security metrics, say there's been a lot of attacks. They haven't killed people, and you could argue that these attacks have killed people, although it's only an estimate from probability.
Right.
So I've been seeing a recent increase in healthcare security leaders reaching out to the company that I work for and asking for help, where those leaders have been like begging for that opportunity from their own leadership and budget for that for a very long period of time.
Yeah, that's why this stuff is important to persuade management care. Just like all the hacks on water districts has made a bunch of people suddenly worry about utilities, as critical infrastructure.
And
we've been worried about this for decades as a possible threat, but now it's becoming a real threat where there's been some real harm.
Yeah. And like some of these organizations have been, like we talked about trends earlier. We talked about like what are the trends in cybersecurity. And for a while, healthcare organizations were explicitly avoided. Like I remember a story about a hacking group that attacked, that compromised a hospital in Germany. And when they discovered that, they said, "Oh, sorry about that," and backed out and put everything back. And I'm getting the sense that they've ceased to care, and they're starting to attack healthcare organizations a lot more, hospitals, emergency rooms, etc., because there's money to be made, and ransomware is flexible, to say the least, like that methodology. But I'm starting to see a significant increase in people going, okay, now it's time to make change, and we know it's been a long time, but
there's this like delicate balance between I want to make money, but I don't want to be like, I want to fly under the radar, right? And I don't think it's like an ethical, moral decision. I'm not going to attack hospitals. It's more of a, if I do, I could generate like attention that could be negative for me.
Sure.
Right? Like,
I think the colonial pipeline.
Again, we're talking about cyber criminals, Sam. Right? We're talking about cyber criminals. Like, what's their moral compass? Right? Like, there's no.
But I think you're right. The colonial pipeline, when they hacked them, and it actually shut down oil distribution on the eastern seaboard, Putin actually gave those hackers up to America. So, I mean, there are certain things that are so offensive that he wouldn't protect his hackers anymore. So that's the point. There's a line, and if you step over the line, then everybody hates you. And that's bad for business.
But that line moves periodically. That trend and what's acceptable changes.
Dude, that line moves all the time. Yeah. I was listening to like some Zero Trust podcast that interviewed Cebu. And Cebu, you know Cebu, right?
I do.
I don't have to give the context there. And Cebu was like, look, like when I first started like crossing that line into cyber criminal, I was attacking enemy nation states to the U.S. And you know what? He says publicly, U.S. didn't care. When they started to care is when I started attacking U.S. targets, and then got a knock on my door after that.
Yeah.
And then, say what you will at Cebu, they were like, this is U.S. law enforcement, like, as far as I understand it, right? They were like, well, you're not going to see your daughters again, right? Like, it kind of puts that in, say what you will about Cebu. I kind of like identify with all the opinions about it, right? But like to hear from his perspective what he was doing, I'm like, oh, like I get it now. But also, like, I wouldn't trust you as far as I can throw you after that, right? Like, there's that. But like, yeah, there's a moral compass that
it shifts.
It does, and it shifts all the time.
Well, there was a group of folks whose name escapes me at the moment, but they filed an SEC report about a company and they were like, hey, we hacked you and you didn't disclose to the SEC within the required 4 days. Like, that's pretty brazen on the
Black
SEC's
Cats, ALPHV.
Yep. That's the one. But there's some publicity that is being enjoyed a bit more or become more accessible to some of these groups that I haven't seen since like like hacking was just shenanigans back in 20, 30 years ago when like there were named hacker groups.
It was a long time ago since hacks were just shenanigans, dude.
Yeah.
Right.
So like named hacker groups that were well known, that were fairly brazen in public, and that they got kind of quiet in order to accommodate for what you were talking about, to be able to maintain their business through secrecy. And now it's starting to become more advantageous, I think, for them to be public because they can get bigger punchline. If you embarrass a company and you can use that to then derive economic value, it's beneficial for you to be public.
Watching the German hacker movie Who Am I, you wonder how much like street cred plays into it, right? Like we all talk about like, is it shenanigans? Is it hacktivism? Is it profit?
One-upmanship?
Blah, blah, blah. Like the whole thing is like, well, how much does street cred play into it? And they really kind of harp on that.
Well, we do that too in our industry. So you take certifications,
and
you do
nowadays
presentations.
we call it branding in marketing.
Right.
It's not
and
just
personal
street
branding
cred.
of the individual. Like the more capture the flag contests you win,
You know what's
the more
funny
money you
though?
make, you know.
In closing thoughts, like Cebu talks about, I think it's really funny when they start talking about hacker movies, right? Like he talks about sneakers, he talks about war games, and he talks about hackers, and it's like kind of crap, right? Like he uses the word crap in reference to hackers, but then goes on this tangent of how like war games is one person in their bedroom kind of doing these attacks, and hackers open it up to it's not just a one person kind of thing, it's a team, it's a collaborative, it's a community
Of
It's how he paints-
rollerbladers.
how he paints
You,
but
you
it's
had
what's
me
interesting,
a crap, Paul.
right? Like he paints it as crap, but then he talks about how influential that crap was to what we do today and how we can like hacker groups work together.
Inspiration
Yeah,
can
but
come
if
from
you-
unlikely places. That's
If you want to argue inspiration, Paul, I mean, most pen testing, red teaming, blue teaming, whatever you want to call them firms these days, their model is still pretty much the plot of Sneakers,
I'm in.
right? Am I right?
Did you get the satellite yet?
You should close on that mic drop, by the way, Paul.
Yeah, but a lot of red teams, we call it red teams because it's a team, Jeff. And what hacker showed us is that it's a team effort.
It's a stretch.
Mic drop.
It's a stretch. Fake birthday cake drop.
Fake birthday. Birthday cake.
Spare no expense.
Over and cake drop.
I love all of you. I love all of our listeners. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
I'll see you in
watching.
2 days, Paul.
Yes. Looking forward to TrueCon this weekend. Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching. Over and out.